Welcome to Galaxy Brains.
An infinite amount of cash.
I'm your host, Alex Thorne.
The U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
Bitcoin made a new all-time high.
If you're not long, you're short.
Satoshi's going to come on there, laugh hysterically, go quiet, all Bitcoin's going to be erased.
Bitcoin's the best crypto asset.
Bitcoin is going to zero.
Welcome back to Galaxy Brains. As always, I'm your host, Alex Thorne, head of firm-wide research at Galaxy. Bitcoin not zero, and we have a great episode for you today. Preston J. Byrne, my friend, lawyer, social media and crypto lawyer of Byrne and Storm, is our guest to talk primarily about the arrest of Telegram founder and CEO Pavel Durov in France and what it means for the future of online publishing and social media and perhaps even crypto. It's a fascinating conversation with Preston, whose content I've been following for a long time. I think you'll enjoy it. Of course, we'll check with our good friend Bimnet Abibi from Galaxy Trading, as always, to talk about markets. And before we get to all of that, I need to remind you to please refer to the link to the disclaimer in the podcast notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice or an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. Phineas, I'm mad. I'm mad about this Telegram founder arrest and what it appears to be about. And it feels like there's an attack on the open internet happening by governments worldwide.
You came into the studio today and you were steamed about this. And we've been talking off air a bit about encouraging you to address the audience directly on some of your thoughts. I mean, the interview does that in great detail as well.
Yeah, but I did want to come out and say exactly why. And there have been there have been decades of attacks on the public's use of encryption, in particular by governments. Governments are very threatened by our ability to talk privately. And that is expanding in certain ways. So it's expanding into the realm of talking publicly about things that might be disfavored speech, right? Perhaps not illegal, but countries, particularly Europe, are making types of speech that traditionally is very much legal in the United States. They're making it illegal in those places. And they're attacking the platforms themselves that allow this free expression. And now, Telegram has encrypted messaging features. They're not enabled by default, and I think most of our audience that uses Telegram probably isn't using them. They don't work, for example, in the group chats that Telegram is so famous for. The charges against Pavel Durov appear to be related to him operating a platform that is used by some of its users for criminal things. He is charged with basically every bad thing on the internet, drug trafficking, fraud, money laundering, child pornography, etc. I don't think anybody believes, although we haven't seen evidence, that he himself is doing these things, right? And that the operation of a platform that allows humans to interact with each other, that is something that humanity, first of all, I'm going to come right out and say we need and we deserve to be successful. And it just seems like, we're going to get into this at length with Preston, but this does have me steamed. Seems like it's an attack on the people's right to use technology. And I really hope we don't end up in a world where you have the American firewall, the European firewall, the great firewall of China, and we are already kind of there, and it's starting to get dicey. And I think some people hope that even public blockchains, but certainly decentralized cryptography tools can be a solution to that. And I don't know, accelerate is what it feels like. It feels like they're coming for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue we wrestle with in America, it seems like on a daily basis and in Congress and with especially the scale of the internet companies that we have, the social media companies primarily.
It's a never-ending battle.
It's a never-ending battle.
When Phil Zimmerman created pretty good privacy PGP, which is an open source, probably the first mass-adopted open source encryption tool, they initially wanted to charge him in the early 90s, the Department of Justice, with the illegal, under the Arms Control Act. They want Arms Export Control Act, whatever it's called. They considered cryptography to be a munition, right? A weapon. They eventually dropped that, luckily, and rightly so. Later, Bill Clinton proposed something called the Clipper chip, a literal chip that they were going to require every electronics manufacturer to put in their device that would, drum roll please, give the government a backdoor, right? Of course, that failed. And by the way, later it was discovered that the Clipper chip was hopelessly vulnerable to backdoor attack by bad actors. This came up again in during in the 2010s when there was the San Bernardino shooting incident. The shooter's iPhone was locally encrypted. Apple refused to construct a tool to break that encryption on the government's behalf. There's stuff that Edward Snowden did release in the Snowden files that showed widespread backdooring of American technology firms, right? Like, this is an ongoing debate and battle, right? So, I am of the personal belief that humans have the right to talk privately, period. And sometimes bad people will talk. I mean, and that's the case. Like, I also am very happy that I live in America where the freedom of speech is guaranteed and mostly absolute. I mean, very few exceptions to that. It doesn't exist in other parts of the world.
Well, it can't be understated how significant this concept is in the industry of crypto and blockchain. It's fundamental, obviously. And I think some of the folks who are on the forefront of this conversation are in this industry. And so, yes, Telegram is, in many ways feels like it represents sort of directly your industry.
It is widely used in crypto, to be clear. Crypto people use Telegram.
Crypto people are privacy people.
Mostly, yeah.
Mostly, right? I mean,
the meetings, a lot of meetings among the minds happen on Telegram.
Yeah.
Partly just because its features are great, leaving aside any privacy tools, right? So it does make you wonder.
Yeah.
And anyway, look, we're going to talk with Preston more about this in a few minutes. First, let's get to our friend Bimnet. Let's go now to our friend Bimnet Abibi from Galaxy Trading. As always, Bimnet, welcome to Galaxy Brains.
Thanks for having me.
We had some interesting stuff has been happening. I guess that's no surprise. Markets are always interesting. But in Jackson Hole last week, the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jay Powell, gave a speech. He seemed to very clearly confirm that the Fed is now more focused on its employment mandate than worried about combating inflation, which seemed like a green light now for rate cuts.
Yeah, no, absolutely. He basically reinforced the expectations for the Fed to cut pretty aggressively over the course of the next year. You had, fixed income rally on the back of his speech, dollar sell off. And so, I think none of what he said really came as a surprise to the market. And in all honesty, you're basically at the point where the Fed recognizes the fact that monetary policy has been restrictive for a long period of time, and that restrictiveness is beginning to impact the labor market. In addition, that restrictiveness may not be warranted with respect to the price level or the rate of change of the price level. And so with that in mind, you probably need to be at neutral sooner rather than later. And what's neutral? Well, let's say 2.5% is neutral. So one could argue that you are, almost 300 basis points away from being at a neutral level of interest rates. And we define a neutral level of interest rates as, a level of interest rates that neither encourages more economic activity nor discourages it from like an aggregate demand and supply standpoint. And so, that happy equilibrium place. And
so we're 300 basis points above that right now.
Yes.
And so that's theoretically 12 cuts, quote unquote. So that's a fairly large amount of cutting from where we are.
Yeah, one could argue that that's where we need to be.
And
the other argument, though, is the neutral rate is now higher.
Yeah.
And so is neutral 3.5? But
they don't actually have to decide that yet. They can start cutting, and then the question is, where do they stop cutting to decide that?
Correct.
Yeah.
And the question is, at what pace should they cut?
But so pace is a magnitude of each cut.
Yes.
But do we expect, and I think I've looked at this chart, historically when they start a cutting cycle or regime, it's a little staircase, right? They take off either 25 or 50 or some amount.
Normally 50.
Basically every time.
Yeah.
For until they get to where they want.
Or it's a dramatic situation and it's like an emergency cut.
True, but
like 100 basis
we don't
points.
think we're there, right?
Yeah.
So we're likely to see either 25 or 50 bips cuts multiple times in a row starting in September. That's what the market basically thinks
so
now.
you now have 100 basis points priced in for the next 3 meetings. So that's a little over 25 per meeting.
Yeah.
And
So that's
then,
like a 150 and 225s or something is the expectation.
and then you have about 195 basis points out to the June 15 meeting in 2025. So that's a lot of cutting.
Yep.
Basically just going in 25
every single time.
Yes.
Yeah. So it is. It's the play. The
that
expectation
is
is the staircase down,
Yes.
basically. Yeah.
But that's absent any kind of like shocks.
Totally. They could pause or do more. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And in theory, it's like if you start to see the unemployment rate ticking meaningfully higher, right?
Cut faster.
You should cut faster.
Yeah.
And there's nothing to tell you that like you shouldn't because the price pressures have gone away.
Right.
Right. And
If
so
inflation stays down, may as well come down.
may as well come down. I mean, the cost of goods have been coming down. You know, oil's had some rebounds because of, you know, geopolitical risks, et cetera. But that's broadly been coming down. The supply side stuff as a function of COVID has, you know, completely abated.
Okay, so there's
And
no longer
now-
the lines of like, millions of truckers unable to get into
Yes.
the port and stuff.
Correct.
The logistics have eased.
Totally eased.
Great.
Fully normalized. And where we've seen the most kind of pressure has been in the services and housing. And, you know, you're starting to see some cooling there.
Yeah.
And
Do you think what's going to happen? What is the expectation for the housing market? If rates come down. I mean, right? Presumably, the cost of mortgages comes down, right? But
housing affordability will improve.
but
in
won't
theory,
it? Yes.
However, it's a little bit trickier. One, it's real estate is very local, so it's dependent on
That's true.
what market you're in.
Right.
If you're in Austin, Texas these days, it's not so good. And even
Well,
if
it's a buyer's market down there.
yes,
Yeah.
even if the mortgage rates come down, right, like it's not going to impact things too much. And then if you're in an area where the supply of homes is still super tight, right, then the prices of homes might not
The
change
mortgage
that much.
Yeah, the borrow cost might come down, but the prices
price
may
of the
not,
home-
and the
correct.
competition may not.
Correct.
Because that's one of the other things. I mean, this is just purely I'm total layman when it comes to the housing market, but if the cost to borrow is reduced, theoretically more buyers show up, right?
and that
so
could push prices.
Yeah.
But in theory, that also means that more supply could come on because folks
I
feel
see.
comfortable.
If there are more
going-
buyers, then you start to get more building as well.
Well, the building's happening. That's part of it. But there's been a lot of folks that are trapped in their homes because
see.
when you're stuck in a home, that's because it's a 3%
Right, because
mortgage.
the values of homes have remained stubbornly high.
because nobody wants to.
But the turnover is very low, right?
Yes.
Like, so people aren't actually. You've got a very valuable asset on paper that you can't actually unload because
Correct.
the market's not very vibrant because there aren't enough buyers.
Yeah, and
I
the
see.
only way to unload it is to take a home equity line, really.
Yeah.
Right, and those rates are really high.
Right.
And so you'll have probably more of both.
So you would say just on net, and I think this might be common sense and knowledge, but just you're an actual smart economic person. On net, lowering the rates here will help the housing market. It'll increase turnover and volumes and get it hopping a bit more again. Whereas right now it's kind of frozen,
I wouldn't call it frozen, but yes,
sticky.
Yes.
Interesting.
So I mean, there's dueling things, but again, the focus of the market and the focus of the Fed is really on the employment picture.
Yeah.
And you had a July non-farm payrolls print that was below trend, and you've had wage pressures that are subsiding, and looking ahead, basically all of next week, you just keep getting more and more labor data, right? So on Wednesday, you've got ADP, you've got ISM services, which will also have an employment component. You have the job opening figures, that JOLTS that are also released next week, in addition to August non-farm payrolls. And so the market will have plenty of information about the current state of the labor market, basically by the end of next week. And I think expectations have come off a lot. And if you start to see a more rapid deterioration in the labor market, that's when the Fed, will probably be forced to aggress in terms of the magnitude of the cuts.
All right, so that would be, broadly speaking, supportive for risk, right? Lower rates.
It's really tough to say. I will
Because
tell
also
you. I will tell you
equities
that,
are like still pretty much at all-time highs.
correct.
So I guess how much more support do we need?
Yes, I would say the most direct impact is in interest rates and currencies.
Yeah.
Right. The dollar has been on the back foot basically since Jackson Hole and a bit before as well. Cable being a really strong outperformer, and euro, I think got up to as high as like 112 and stuff. And so and then the BOJ move obviously took dollar yen from 160s to the low 140s and stuff. So you've had a dollar which in all essence is just a function of relative rates and stuff. Move with the front end pricing. And so those, I would say, are the two markets most directly impacted. On the equity side, it's if the employment picture is getting worse and if the Fed is responding to a worsening employment picture, like that's bad news is bad news.
Yeah.
Right? Like people will spend less on discretionary items, like consumer discretionary. Companies are already not doing well. Just look at some of these high-flying like fashion brands and the other consumer thing.
Right,
Like,
I
those
saw
things
something
are,
about luxury watches not doing well. In fact, some newspaper threatened to blame crypto for that. But I think
it's possible. But you are seeing folks pinching their belts and wallets, and so that has a multiplier effect on the economy. At the same time, companies can now finance debt at cheaper levels.
They can.
Bad companies that have a lot of debt maturing in the next year or two will be able to refinance at lower rates. If you take a lot of earnings are also outside of the U.S. And so if you see material depreciation in the dollar, they'll actually bring back more revenues to U.S. companies to the tune of about an extra 2% or something to EPS based on the magnitude of this move. So there are parts of the rate move that will help companies, but bad news is bad news when you're at all-time highs already.
Yeah, that's fair. All right, real quick, let's talk about crypto markets because over the weekend, actually, we were running pretty high. We'll stick to Bitcoin here. Bitcoin ran about as high as almost 65K, I think maybe.
65K was the high, yeah.
Yeah, and it was doing fine, chugging along, and then basically on Monday, really started to break down, and as we talk now, we're about 59K. I saw us go as low as about 58K again. Shout out Bitcoin 58K gang. Why? What this is what on the back of a weak dollar, theoretically at least constructive Fed to something like Bitcoin.
No, I mean, yeah.
What's going on here with the corn, and obviously others performed even worse, but
yeah, so you had a short squeeze that got you up to 65K, and then you had some natural profit taking in BTC. It's also worth keeping in mind that basically a month ago we were at 50K, so there's a lot of buyers that were heavily in the money.
Right, 50 you buy at the 50
if
low,
you bought at
and
50
you sell
to
at 65. That's a nice move.
That's a nice
in a
move
month
to capture.
Yeah,
and so folks have done real well. And then you still have GOX distributions that are ongoing, and basically what happened yesterday was in the afternoon, it's literally the last week of August, lots of folks off desk.
Yeah.
I want to say I read some stat that this week we had probably one of the most illiquid weeks in the S&P, like in terms of volume wise.
Like what, ever?
Like this year.
Yeah.
And so it really wasn't a liquid period, and so you had a sell off that got exacerbated by liquidations into low liquidity, into dealers that were, basically short about $20 million a gamma at the 60K price point. And so you had $2 billion of OI wiped out, and, short gamma positioning and GOX distributions,
but mostly
into probably one of the most liquid periods of the day and year.
Yep, makes sense. Technical, some overhang. I mean, the GOX distributions you're talking about are from the distributors to their end users and clients,
correct,
right? Because we've seen, I think, what we expect is, and again, we don't know, but we expect from the GOX estate that all has been distributed now. But of course, that's getting sent to Kraken, BitGo, Bitstamp, whomever over the last month and a half, and at some point they actually give those coins to people. But otherwise, it sounds like I'm mostly hearing a move, a technical move, a profit-taking move exacerbated by market structure. Nothing doesn't feel like panic out there, does it?
Does not. But I will say that, it is concerning the decoupling from macro that you've had. You're talking about a dollar that's been super heavy over the past couple of weeks.
Which has usually been constructive for
which
Bitcoin.
is good. But just think about gold, right?
Yeah.
One of
All-time highs.
All-time. I mean, it's off a little bit today.
Yeah, but over the last couple of weeks.
Oh yeah, you're trading at all-time highs in the biggest monetary debasement hedge in markets or
in human history.
Yeah, yeah, right. And then equities have obviously, S&P was within spitting distance of fresh all-time highs.
I think one of them, I can't remember, it might have even been the Dow, but
Dow hit an all-time high yesterday.
One of the intraday all-time high.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, it is concerning that we've decoupled so much from traditional markets. And, I'd say the other concerning part is just, one of the reasons that people like crypto and like Bitcoin is because of the upward price moves.
For sure. Number go up.
Number go
it's
up.
The best advertising that you've got.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when you lose that and you don't really have a catalyst outside of Trump starting to do better in the presidential debates and polling, it does kind of leave you with being like,
where do we go from here?
Where do we go from here?
Yeah. Well, we're
but there's a lot on the horizon over the next 6 months.
Well, we're going to get into that on next week's show because I want to thank you, Bimnet Abibi from Galaxy Trading, for coming on Galaxy Brains.
Thanks for having me.
Let's go now to our guest, Preston Byrne, partner at Byrne & Storm, adjunct professor at Fordham Law. Preston, welcome to Galaxy Brains.
Hey, what's going on, man?
Great to have you on. I've always wanted to have you on the show. I've been following Preston for a long time. I think many of our audience may know him from his many myriad and I don't know, decade plus long takes on crypto and the law on Twitter. He's a great follow. Recommend it. But we have a very timely topic to talk about because Preston, your practice has focused over the years on both crypto, but also free speech and social media and messaging. Is that right?
Yeah, so basically I operate in what my friend Maya Zahavi, who's also been around crypto for a decade, refers to as dissident tech. So that's crypto is a big part of it. Social media is a big part of it. Censorship-resistant communications and other types of applications that exist outside of the big Apple, Google ecosystem is part of it too. So that's this, the current issues with Telegram, which I think we're about to talk about, are very much over the target in terms of what I practice day to day.
Yeah, really happy to have you on to talk about that news of the day. Telegram founder Pavel Durov arrested by French, what I said was Secret Service. I assume that's some kind of federal police arrested by. We can talk about that in Paris. And currently, as we record this, I think still in jail, awaiting some kind of bail or whatever the process is. That's why you're here. We'll talk about that and some other stuff. Maybe its impact on the open network, which is the ton sort of blockchain, but also are there implications more broadly for blockchains? I'm not sure. I'm going to ask you in a bit, but first maybe tell us what happened and what Pavel is charged with in your view.
Yeah, so what happened was Pavel Durov, for whatever reason, being a jet-setting global entrepreneur, presumably worth a couple of bucks, decided he was going to fly to Paris, where he's a French citizen and he's also a citizen of the UAE. So he flew to Paris, and if the media reporting from French media sources is correct, when he was on his way there, a judicial warrant was hurriedly executed for his arrest, and he was arrested as soon as he put down on the tarmac. So the list of charges came out. So initially, everybody said we don't know what the charges are. There was an initial release from the Ministry of Justice via the press, via a leak, which mentioned all of the sort of big bads of the internet, narcotics trafficking, gang RICO, child pornography, all that sort of stuff. And then what happened was we found out what the charges were, and it turns out he's been charged with a laundry list of offenses, but mainly what they equate to are complicity or complicité in French, which is roughly equivalent to what Americans would call aiding and abetting for, again, all of those aforementioned crimes, money laundering, gang activity, fraud, narcotics trafficking, and also a couple of specific offenses relating to the unlicensed importation of cryptological tools via the encrypted chat feature on Telegram, right? Which is not principally an encrypted app. We see a lot of people on on the internet saying, well, Telegram's not an encrypted messenger. That's mostly correct. But it does have some encrypted features, and apparently those have attracted some criminal liability for him in France. So where we are is we're just waiting to see what happens. I don't think he's been I'm not sure he's been formally charged. I think he's still in sort of like a pre-arraignment detention phase. I'm not too familiar with French criminal procedure. But long story short, he's in the hands of the authorities, and so far it appears like they're not minded to let him out.
Right, and they released a list of. I guess I agree. I think actually where we know these charges isn't that they've been read in front of a court, as far as I've seen. It's that the Justice Ministry or whomever has released a list of what he will be charged with.
Yeah.
All right, let's break that down into the two buckets. I think we'll start with the complicity question because that's. But that importation of cryptological tools is a very important one that we need to talk about as well. But this complicity, these alleged offenses, as far as we can see in that charge, they all are preceded, whether it's the child pornography, the terrorism, the gang stuff, the trafficking, the narcotics, the fraud, it's all preceded by this complicity. So they're not alleging that he himself is doing these things. Who are they saying he is complicit with? Who has he aided and abetted?
Yeah, that's a good question, and we don't know. So the complicity offense, and excuse me if I look like I'm not looking at the camera, I'm just pulling up the language here. In French terms, it's Article 121-6 and 121-7 of the Code Penal. Involves, quote, knowingly facilitating, helping, or assisting the preparation of a criminal offense, procuring an offense through gift, promise, threat, order, or abuse of authority or power, or giving instructions to commit an offense. So it appears he's been charged with that, right? So normally, if you were going to see that in, say, an American context, because I think most of your listeners are probably from the US, that requires something akin to active, knowing, willful participation in the crime with the intent to bring about the unlawful result.
Like driving the getaway car, basically, right?
Driving the getaway car, or your friend comes to you and says, "Hey, I want to deal some drugs. Can you lie for me when I'm doing this?" And you say, "No problem." Now, the default position in the US with social media companies is that social media companies are not liable, right, for the torts and crimes of their users as a general rule. This includes federal crimes. This includes, if someone's using a platform for drug dealing, if someone's using a platform to facilitate terrorism, there's no affirmative obligation on these companies to either remove that content, scan for it, interdict it, because of a variety of statutory provisions in what they say. So the general operating procedure for most social media companies in terms of their regulatory compliance posture has been that if they aren't, affirmatively participating in criminal offenses, they don't expect that anyone's going to arrest them for it. And this has been standard operating procedure for the last 30 years. Now, in this instance, it appears that Durov has been charged with this complicity offense in France, which is aiding and abetting, right? And they're basically alleging that he's participating in a crime. So I look at that and I see one of two possibilities. Possibility A, right, is that he has in fact been running this as a criminal enterprise, and he is in fact actively facilitating all these activities. In his case, this would probably be a really bad idea because he lives in the United Arab Emirates. And let's take one of the charges, the narcotics complicity charge. If he were to do that in the UAE, the maximum penalty in the UAE for that crime is death. The maximum penalty for that crime in the United States, which is really good at extraditing people, is life in prison, right? So it's not something where you would normally, just because he lives in the UAE doesn't mean he's in some lawless Wild West. In fact, it means he's in a jurisdiction which has very strict regulations around this kind of activity, and it's really not in his interest to do it. So that says, okay, well, let's assume, just for sake of argument, that it makes no sense for Durov to be trying to deliberately run a criminal enterprise. What's the alternative possibility? The alternative possibility is that the French government is taking its complicity statute. They've decided that the level of criminality on the platform or his noncompliance, for example, with judicial requests is intolerable for them. And what they're doing is they're applying a broad local doctrine. And I'm not an expert in French law, doing a little homework on it right now, but really waiting for French commentators and for the arrests and other news to come out because I have a day job, unfortunately. Can't just be sitting around researching French law. But basically, the alternative possibility is that it's an overbroad application of a local rule to try to police the content that's being hosted by a global company. The relevance is, if indeed that is the case, regardless of whatever the French legal arguments are, because this is so divergent from what you would normally expect a country to do to a social media company, it is basically a shot across the bow to anyone else. Most social media companies of consequence that aren't Chinese are based in the United States.
Right.
It's basically a shot across the bow saying, listen, your business practices can get you thrown in prison in France, and likely anywhere else in Europe where they can get a European arrest warrant. So the long story short is I don't think it's safe for U.S. social media companies to be doing business in Europe right now.
Yeah, I think that, by the way, as we're speaking, I've just been notified that Telegram founder Pavel Durov was released from police custody in France and transferred to a court for questioning ahead of a possible indictment, prosecutors told CNN. So the process is moving along here. He's not, I guess, being held in jail at the moment. Good. That's a positive step, I would say. Let's talk about, as I hear your two possibilities. Yes, I think the first one, if he created Telegram and is operating it for his own intentional purpose to actually do terrorism, child pornography, narcotics trafficking, that's a bit different than holding him liable as a communications intermediary for the crimes of his users. But I think you're right I think our default position, absent any new information, is probably that it's the latter, that that it is a global platform that has plenty of non-illegal uses, and that he certainly intends for most of it to be above board, and he's instead being caught up in a dragnet related to the behaviors of his users, and perhaps he's not complying. Let me ask you about that part, because I think the second charge is related to some refusal, or we'll say inefficient level of responsiveness from Telegram to lawful law enforcement requests. And I want to ask you about that also in relation to an American company. We have these, the Communications Decency Act, Section 230, as well as perhaps a variety of other laws and constitutional protections, typically, as you said, would prevent the founder, like Sergey Brin or Mark Zuckerberg, from being literally arrested because someone did something illegal on their platform. But what if they were those American social media companies? They still respond to lawful legal service for takedowns, information, right? I mean, what if they were to not? Could they, under current law, would you be able to be arrested if Mark Zuckerberg started refusing to comply with, or I should say, if Meta started refusing to comply with lawful service from American investigators? And could that go to Mark Zuckerberg ultimately?
So if Meta, which is incorporated in Delaware, I believe, and headquartered in SF or Menlo Park, decided to stop answering U.S. requests, right?
Yeah.
That would be a big problem. Telegram's not a French company. So so Durov is a French citizen. So there's a principle called judicial comity, COMITY, not EDY, where, generally speaking, one jurisdiction doesn't try to step on the toes of what's properly within bounds for a different jurisdiction. So if you're in the U.S. and you get a lawful order from a U.S. court and you don't obey it, there are going to be consequences for that. But let's just assume, for sake of argument, that Facebook got a French order and it says, you know what, for whatever reason, this French order is not something we're able to comply with because of U.S. data protection law or, our own personal preferences. The default next step is not for the French to seek to extradite that person from the United States. The next step is for them to go to the treaty procedure and the Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, and you can insist on this, right? If there's a request which comes in and you don't think it conforms to the First Amendment, or you don't think you're able to make that disclosure under data privacy law, or you just don't want to, then you can tell that country, listen, I'm in the United States. I'm not subject to your rules. I'm subject to American rules. There's a treaty procedure. If you want to domesticate this order in an American court, you can do that. But you have to go through the State Department, the DOJ, and then a federal court in the United States before that'll happen. I think Durov's mistake in this instance is A, that he's a French national, and B, that he's a French national who set foot on French soil, in the context where there's potential disobedience of French rules. In which case, France has a significantly stronger argument that they should put hands on him. But if you're an American in the United States and you're content to go on vacation in Colorado instead of, I don't know, Berlin or Paris, really, there's not a lot the French can do to compel data disclosure unless a U.S. court agrees that under the applicable treaty procedure that you should be mandated to hand it over.
Yep. I think, all right, let's talk about the big issue question here, which is that if it is, again, not direct, knowledgeable, intentional complicity with actual crimes, but instead merely operating a global platform that is used for legitimate and illegitimate uses, just like every platform is, right? What does that tell you, Preston, about the state? You said something pretty bold, pretty harsh and bold, that American social media companies should not perhaps be doing if it is a shot across the bow. Like, walk us through in your mind what the implications are more broadly for freedom of speech, the relationship between citizens and their governments, et cetera. Like, where does your mind go if it is indeed sort of the first in an escalating shot across the bow here against social media and messaging companies?
Yeah. So if that's the case, and the key word there is if, we don't know whether this is the French really, we don't know whether the primary motivation here is, actual complicity in a crime or just an overbroad application of the complicity statute in France in order to police, engage in content moderation,
right,
or apply leverage for content moderation. Most people in tech suspect, right, because it doesn't make any sense that Durov would be running a criminal enterprise.
Well, especially
doesn't
doing all of those specific crimes. We're supposed to believe he was simultaneously a child porn peddler, a narcotics trafficker, a terrorism abettor,
a money
and a
launderer.
fraudster. I mean, come on,
Right.
like that's just like you said, it's every bad thing on the internet, basically. So it's
Right. And
I agree that your point about tech people,
so,
we are assuming that it's platform related.
Right. We're assuming it's platform related. I think it's actually, to be blunt, in this case, sometimes you see bad legal takes on Twitter. In this case, my operating assumption as a professional is that this is what's happening. And so I actually think that assumption is correct, but it is still to be determined. We don't know.
Right.
But if indeed, right, it turns out that this is a content moderation issue, what it means is that any other social media platform which either is in a position or minded to decline a French law enforcement request, or is minded to platform content, which is legal in the United States and not legal in France, of which there is a great deal, or is minded to operate its business in accordance with American regulatory approaches instead of French regulatory approaches. If any of those things are true, right, and if indeed this is a moderation issue, then it's not safe for any American company to have any personnel who are involved with content moderation. That includes the CEO, the board, the executive team in the European Union for the foreseeable future. This is because this is if you run a massively available open access publishing platform, it is inevitable, right? And I repeat, inevitable as in it is an absolute certainty that people are going to use that information channel to break the law. Mm-hmm. And this is true with small platforms, it's true with medium-sized platforms, it's true with large ones. And if indeed this is the approach that they're taking with Telegram, and even if, right, it's just because Telegram has been identified by the Ministry of Justice as being a platform where there's so much criminality that it warrants deviation from usual practice. No one is safe, right? Meredith Whittaker Signal is actually encrypted, right? As far as we know. And without a doubt, there's illegal activity which happens on there. We know that the FBI and other law enforcement agencies seek that data, send subpoenas, send search warrants, and get basically non-responses from Signal because Signal doesn't have the data to hand over. So from that point of view, I think and WhatsApp, same situation, right? We know, for example, that WhatsApp is widely used by the Taliban. It's basically the central communications infrastructure for the Afghan government that's in violation of U.S. sanctions, right? It's been happening for the entirety of the Afghan war. It happened at the end of the Afghan war in the end game. It happens today. And so that's illegal, right? That's an illegal use of the platform. Mark Zuckerberg is not getting dragged out of his house in Hawaii and arrested because the United States doesn't arrest social media CEOs for that. So France has kind of signaled that it is off limits, and by extension, to the extent that it's willing to go and, issue European arrest warrants, basically the entire EU is off limits. And it's not just for social media. I think anything where you have user-generated content being created at scale and transacted at scale, where you're hosting infrastructure, including crypto, running a node, for example, running a full node, including generative AI. If you're doing an LLM startup and someone's asking the LLM, how do I do this illegal thing? How do I cook meth in my kitchen? And you're not policing that. Essentially,
do you remember that Taliban? There was the Al Qaeda magazine, How to Make a Bomb in the Kitchen of Your Mom. There was like a famous. I guess they had an actual publication. Anyway, I'm just saying.
I must have missed. I think I might have been. I might have been living in the UK at the time, and possession. Unfortunately, possession of those materials in the UK is itself a crime. So,
I just remember
I
back
must have missed that one.
Yeah, during the War on Terror, like the height of it, there was reporting that Al Qaeda had a glossy magazine, and like they showed like the a picture of the front of the magazine, right, the cover, and like the big cover story was literally how to build a bomb in the kitchen of your mom, and I just remember it because it rhymed too. I was like, that is a pretty funny,
and that, like,
catchy
possession
title.
Yeah, and possession of that, I mean, so at least in the UK, when it was part of the
Yeah.
EU, right, possession of that material, mere possession, without some reasonable excuse, is itself a crime. There was a guy named Rizwan Sabir, who is of Middle Eastern extraction. He was at a university in the Midlands studying for a PhD, right? And he was writing his PhD on, guess what? Islamic terrorism was a topic which interested him because, that's what, for whatever reason, that's what he wanted to do. There are lots of people who do that. But because he had a Middle Eastern name and he was found in possession of the materials, he was charged with offenses under the Terrorism Acts for possessing those materials. So, like, what's illegal, right, in the European Union in terms of content and how it's illegal is a much, for just speech, nonviolent materials, publications, is a much wider net than what we have in the United States.
Yeah, we have, there's a reason, and we don't need to go deep into whether the First Amendment actually applies on these private platforms and whatever, which is, I know, a more complicated legal question in general, and perhaps the answer is no, right? The First Amendment protects you from the government when it relates to speech, not specifically. It doesn't give you the right.
And it protects the platform too. So the platform has the platform, foreign or domestic, has First Amendment rights vis-a-vis the U.S. government. So
yeah. So, but that is a core difference, though. There is no First Amendment in Europe. There is no guaranteed right to free speech. There's a reason. I don't know. I think there's some procedural reasons why, but I think it's reasonable to point out that it's the very first amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Is the very first of the Bill of Rights. Is the freedom of speech, association, religion, right, assembly.
Well, in Europe, it's the 10th. So if you look at the European human rights law, is derived from something called the European Convention, which was created after the Second World War, after the horrors of fascism. And Russia is a signatory to the European Convention. How closely they follow Strasbourg jurisprudence is another question. But the European Convention, Article 10, right, is what says everybody has a right to freedom of expression. However, there's Article 10, sub 2, which says, oh, and by the way, we grant this thing called a margin of appreciation to signatory states to deviate or derogate is the formal term from those rights in the event that there's the rights of others are being affected, or we don't like it, or it's a security concern, or the needs of a democratic society, whatever that means. And so it's a very broad exception. And basically, when member states finally decide, or signatories to the convention finally decide, you know what, actually, we don't like this speech, Strasbourg, 9 times out of 10, is going to say, well, that's not really our business. That's their policy to decide what free speech rights you have and you don't within their own borders.
Yeah, so take the UK, which you've been commenting on, and you're a longtime follower, right? They've had these protests, and I've seen plenty of stuff on social media. Maybe you know better than I too, but like of regular UK citizens being arrested, having police show up at their homes effectively because they said something mean about someone or a political official on social media, right? That would presumably be in that. First of all, has that been happening? I mean, I'm just on Twitter. I mean, is it? I'm not sure if it has been. Sometimes I worry I'm in an echo chamber.
Yeah, it has been happening, but I mean, it's not just the riots. People have been getting arrested for causing gross offense on the internet for years, and they're arrested by the thousands every single year. Wow. So you see thousands of people are arrested every single year because someone read something they wrote and they were offended by it, and the police agreed with it, and then a magistrate applying very broad judicial discretion because they don't have the First Amendment concluded that assessment by the police was correct.
Yeah, I mean there are limitations to free speech. As certain types of violence incitement, I think, is the main one in the U.S., right? Specifically under the First Amendment. Very high bar, though. Very, very high bar. It's been a while since I studied constitutional law, but I did at one point take the con law class at Vanderbilt when I was an undergrad, and I just recall the bar being unbelievably high. So like there isn't an asterisk the size that you could drive a Winnebago through in the U.S. First Amendment the way there is in this European.
That's correct. Yeah, that's right. We call it the imminent lawless action test. So basically, in the United States, you're allowed to advocate in a nonviolent fashion for any idea, even a violent idea. So you can turn around and you can say, I think it would be a really good idea if the people of the United States would overthrow their government by force and kill everybody who opposes it. That isn't, I mean, you'll wind up on a watch list, right? If you do that, for sure. Yeah. And you might not be very popular, and maybe the Daily Dot is going to write some hit pieces about you. But you are allowed to do that without getting arrested. The difference between here and the UK, so you can advocate for anything. The imminent lawless action test says that when you're dealing with that kind of inflammatory speech, the unless the speech is directed towards the production of imminent lawless action and right, not or, and likely to give rise to or result in such action. So it directed towards it, intended, and likely to result. Then you're not going to be arrested for it. So if you say, "Listen, I believe in insurrection against the United States," okay, fine. Go write a book about it. That's great. Go
ahead
do
and
a blog
believe
post. Go do a podcast. Go believe it all you want. But
Right.
if you're standing there and you've got an armed battalion of people in front of the U.S. Capitol and you're saying, let's overthrow the government, go over to the Capitol and do that, then you have that imminence and likeliness requirement satisfied because it's going to happen. So,
and that basically is the only restriction, right, on the First Amendment, freedom of speech. Like, for the most part.
There are loads of restrictions, but the key thing is that, and this is not a legal test, this is a sort of layman's description of what's allowed. The nonviolent expression of any opinion, right, including opinions that call for and advocate for violence, is permitted. So you can't threaten people. You can't threaten people. You can't harass people, right? You can't. It's not free speech to call someone's house 4,000 times at 2 a.m. Or direct an online mob to do that. Right. It's free speech to engage, and you can't police the ideas, right? So basically, if you, on the basis of the content of the speech, that is not the content of the idea being expressed. The government's not allowed to step in, but it's a little more complicated than that, obviously.
Totally, but it's much more absolute than in Europe. That's I guess the core of my point here.
For political rhetoric expressed nonviolently, it is very nearly absolute. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to something. Let's get back to Telegram. Thank you both Preston and our audience for indulging me in this little deviation on my nerdy love of the First Amendment. Let's talk about the platform again. And you had mentioned something: content publishers, including perhaps blockchain networks, and obviously Telegram sort of really raises this question even more acutely than it might otherwise, although they've always been related: messaging apps, cryptography, right? And then we'll talk about the cryptology charges that the French authorities are also raising. But because Telegram initially wrote and coded what's called the Open Network, TON, and there's a whole backstory here we don't have to get into about their fundraise where they had to give the money back to their investors and blah, blah. But ultimately, they released that source code for the nodes, the wallets, everything publicly, open source, and it was separately launched, this blockchain network known as TON, TON. And now separately, although I don't see it, maybe because I'm in America, I may not be allowed to, but apparently it's widely integrated now into the Telegram app. So you can send and receive like ton tokens and whatever else that's on there. And we looked, this blockchain is almost entirely just TON and USDT. Like the total TVL is basically 2 DEX pools that are just ton USDT pools. So like you can buy and sell ton basically. And there's apparently a game called Hamster Combat, which is like you just click as fast as you can and and it's integrated.
Anyway, that sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah,
I don't want to play that.
I haven't tried it. It does sound good. So I'm going to say they have a blockchain network, but as a result of a settlement with the SEC, it's not clear that actually Telegram runs it, but Telegram itself is certainly integrated with it. So it raises that core question, Preston, or do you think it does? Either in this instance, is it possible? I mean, I'm looking at that money laundering charge and wondering if it relates to the use of the ton token. We don't know. It could. But also more broadly, like, does a miner, let's say a Bitcoin miner in a European country, say a Nordic one with lots of hydro or whatever, wherever they might be, or a Solana validator or a home node operator that doesn't even mine but merely relays transactions, are they at risk of this type of content moderation criminal offense in your mind, either in the near term or in the long run? Like, what's your how does that apply?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there are mentions of cryptocurrency from the Ministry of Justice in this. I think that what they're probably referring to are the widespread proliferation of crypto scams, airdrop scams, various other things in the platform, and maybe the use of the platform to, I don't know, for OTC trading, things like that, some things of that nature. That haven't been adequately policed from a content moderation perspective. I think the ton situation is so new, and it would be so weird, right, for that to be stacked onto all those other charges, which seem to be based around a content moderation argument rather than anything else. So it's certainly an interesting angle to consider how the integration of particular coins and particular apps didn't Signal do an integration with like Moxie Marlinspike's project or something? Which
Yeah,
app was it?
it was Signal. I don't think they ever actually. I've never actually seen it in my Signal app either. But yes, there was a Signal coin. It was I think Mobi or Mobile Coin was the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
coin. Yeah.
So I think that I'm not sure that on that I'm not sure it's focused on ton in that integration. I think it's much more likely relating to the actual content
Yeah.
that users post in the platform. But in terms of where Bitcoin and other crypto projects sit, crypto is this weird hybrid of a transactional system and a publisher, right? So on the one hand, if you're running a full node, you're a publisher, right? You're publishing transactions, some of which have information in them, right? You're not actually facilitating the transactions. You're not actually relaying the transactions. You're not taking custody. You're not engaged in money transmission because that involves, at least in the United States, the acceptance of funds and then the transmittal of funds. And if you're running a full node, as you know, you're not taking custody of those assets. You're
Right.
simply acknowledging and publishing a record that the transaction has occurred. Is it conceivable, right, that they could try to expand this to say, you know what, if you're running a Bitcoin full node or an Ethereum archive node, I don't know how many, maybe all three people who are doing that, but if you're running an Ethereum archive node and you've got illegal content on there, or there's some IP chain on there and there's some illegal content there, is there liability? I think right now, no, but if they get away with this, right, and if that becomes accepted standard operating procedure in Europe, it doesn't take much of a stretch for an enterprising politician to turn around and say, you know what, this other project here is just as disfavored as Telegram is. We've decided we don't like Bitcoin because it's used by, this list of big bads who we don't like. And then attempting to extend that principle to anyone who's running a full node. Is it a stretch? Absolutely, right? But given what we've seen, is what France is currently doing a stretch? Yeah, because it's never happened before. It's an issue of first impression. And as far as I can tell, and as far as we can tell so far, the accusation could be levied at virtually any encrypted messaging provider. And I'm cognizant some listeners are going to say, well, Telegram's not mostly encrypted. There's only an encrypted feature. Fine, yes, I agree. Fine. But there's no reason why if it turns out that Signal becomes the platform du jour for illegal activity, that Signal messenger is not going to know, right? They're not going to be able to see, they're not going to be able to tell, but they're going to be facilitating it in much the same manner that Durov does. And so the French government might say, take additional means, or WhatsApp. Facebook has, with WhatsApp and the Taliban, and this is not a dig at Facebook. I'm actually kind of happy with Facebook after Zuckerberg finally admitted that he'd been jawboned by the U.S. government, been violating his user speech rights. So he's on our team now. So I think we need to do everything we can to make sure he stays on our team, which is great. So, but let's say Facebook, right? The Taliban usage, they could take additional measures to stop the use of WhatsApp by the Taliban. They could block the entirety of Afghan IP ranges. They could block Afghan SIM cards. And they could say, we're not going to service Afghanistan. And that would essentially wipe out most of the current users and force them to start from scratch with SIM cards from other countries and VPNs and various other things. All tools which, of course, are available and usable, but it would just increase the difficulty of using that system for that unlawful purpose really, really significantly. Facebook doesn't do that. And Mark Zuckerberg doesn't live in exile. He lives in Hawaii, in his bunker compound on one of the islands. And he doesn't worry that the U.S. government's going to come calling, because we don't, as a general rule, hold social media companies liable for the crimes of their users.
Right. I think there are some efforts in the U.S. at the federal level to expand, I would say, the level of culpability that a blockchain node could have. I think the most notable is the Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act, introduced by Senator Elizabeth Warren. Now, it's not primarily around this speech and content, although it's sort of related. Her bill seeks to apply the Bank Secrecy Act to parts of the public blockchain technology infrastructure stack, including miners, nodes, smart contracts, perhaps even open source software developers. But that is that feels like it emanates more from financial crime sort of sanctions policy, control of the financial system, than it does from the free speech content moderation wing of the anti-freedom push. But I don't know, are those related in your mind?
They are, because they stem from a common desire to want to bring the internet under firm and complete and total state control. So this is a and the left and the right in the United States have both put forward policy proposals that would do this. I think for the right, it's just totally asinine to do that because they're basically putting, all of the institutions in the United States government, universities, and the media are controlled by the left. So I don't understand why they would want to give them more power to regulate the one place where right wing thought is allowed to proliferate. But no, they come from the same place. It's a desire for control, and governments are afraid of that which they can't control. And right now, that's the internet, messaging, and crypto. So even though they are along different axes, the legal issues are very different. They come politically from the same place.
Mm-hmm. What do you think is there a long-term solution to this in the United States? Like, I mean, do we need this might be a little bit out there, but people have talked about a digital bill of rights or a new amendment that more explicitly codifies the right to privacy on the internet or privacy of your personal data, something that expands the Fourth Amendment's prohibition of illegal searches and seizures of your houses, papers, and effects to like more clearly state like that. And, for example, we have the third party doctrine, right? Like, well, the government has argued, I think successfully many times, that, oh, well, wait a sec, your Gmail, that's not actually in your property because it's on Google servers, so we can just go directly to them to get it and not to you. We might be in the best situation as a country in terms of the codified legal and even constitutional principles that protect Americans and their privacy and speech and et cetera. But there's more to do, is there not? Because it feels like this is constantly creeping across all governments worldwide, including our own.
Yeah, I think the First Amendment's doing a pretty good job on the publishing side of things and really doesn't require too much by way of changes. It just requires that the courts continue to be staffed by sensible jurists. On the Fourth Amendment side, the Fourth Amendment also does a pretty good job. There was Carpenter versus United States a couple, about, I don't know, 6, 7 years ago, where they said that geolocation data came with or was accompanied by a reasonable expectation of privacy, and therefore it couldn't be obtained without a warrant and couldn't be voluntarily disclosed by a cell phone company. There was a recent judgment, I can't remember which judicial circuit it came out of, where the practice of getting geographic or aerial warrants. So the FBI will turn around and say, okay, here's point Alpha, Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta, and everything in there, we want all that data. So a court said that was an impermissible, constitutionally impermissible general warrant. And so as a consequence, the FBI shouldn't be doing that anymore. And we saw this after January 6th. They basically said, Capitol Mall, here are the four corners. Tell us everyone who was inside and every cell phone ping that you got in that location. So I think the Fourth Amendment does a pretty good job. In terms of like third-party records, we also have the Stored Communications Act, which requires law enforcement in non-emergency situations to obtain a subpoena, something called the 2703D order or a search warrant if they're going to obtain either subscriber data, message metadata, or content data, respectively. So does a pretty good job on that. And ultimately, it is someone else's record on someone else's machine, which is being stored, not necessarily in the clear, encrypted at rest, but they hold the keys, and so they can see your information. I think 95%, 98% of the challenge is just baking in end-to-end encryption in everything, at which point they can disclose the records, but your communications are going to be private. Now, that doesn't make the obtaining of those records impossible, right? It just means that the law enforcement has to go to the source. They have to go to you. They have to go to your computer in order to obtain them, rather than having this massive treasure trove of information, which can be obtained by law enforcement, but equally can also be obtained by foreign threat actors, for example. Mm-hmm. I think something like every social security number in the United States was recently leaked from a hack in the government. We should just replace social security numbers with Bitcoin keys. Seriously.
I know, honestly, private keys would be much better. And there was that Office of Personnel Management hack. Do you remember that one? Like at this point, maybe like 8 or 10 years. It was basically every federal employee, including all like intelligence agency employees.
Everyone with a security clearance at any level, including yours truly. They offered me 3 years of Experian coverage. It was a real. I felt really loved.
And then there was. I don't want to misname it, but one of the credit agencies, maybe it was Experian also. I can't remember what one of them was also hacked. So it was like every person in America's entire financial and credit history.
Right, is known to the Chinese government in all likelihood, or the North Koreans. Yeah. So I think we get most of the way there. There are technical solutions to this, both on the free speech side. You have stuff like Nostr, which last time I used it was borderline unusable.
It seems to be doing a little bit better. You got to come back on there. I was on there.
Yeah,
notes and other stuff through relays.
Yeah, so I'm going to check out Nostr again. People have been badgering me about it on Twitter, so I'm going to check it out again. But last time, I think it was 2 years ago, and it was
Yeah.
it was clunky and difficult to use. So that's one angle. You also have Farcaster protocol, Warpcast. That's
Yep.
another angle. So that's an interesting one, because what they do is they say, listen, our content database is global, right? So that basically every post ever posted anywhere is global. We're not going to store image data. Everything's going to be hyperlinks, which really reduces the amount of bandwidth that they need to, that a NOS or a Farcaster node needs to supply. The global state of the database is available everywhere. And if you need to do censorship on account of a local rule, right, which exists everywhere, censorship and or specifically moderation is a requirement in every country, including the United States, for certain types of illegal content. What you do is you just censor at the application level, right, but not at the database level, where basically you de-index the post. So that's another approach where you could say, listen, we're going to create this global repository of information for regulatory requirements. Someone who's running an interface, a front end, is going to be able to do the moderation, and they'll just de-index infringing content and comply with the reporting requirements and other things. That's another approach. And also we have sort of the Elon or Andrew Torba approach. In Torba's case with Gab is a U.S. company. He said very clearly on social media this week he doesn't leave the United States to go abroad. And there's a reason for that, right? Mm-hmm. Because abroad they have different rules. So that's one strategy. Elon's strategy is another one, which is where Twitter has basically, or X as it's now known, X has its headquarters in the United States. It is basically, Radio Free Europe at this point in terms of certain political viewpoints, which can't be expressed anywhere else. Mm-hmm. And it'll be interesting they're on a collision course, right?
They are, right? I think a lot of people have, a lot of people have raised this before. He did an X Spaces, which is like a live phone call with former President Donald Trump about 2 or 3 weeks ago. He received a threatening letter from effectively the UK's Office of Content Moderation.
No, he received a letter from Thierry Breton. So that's the EU's commissioner of the internal market.
Oh, I thought, okay, so even more relevant here. I thought for some reason it was the UK, but it was the EU directly.
Yeah, it was the EU, and Thierry apparently he
reminding him not to promote misinformation and his obligations under EU law and this is the other area, right? You've been talking about, you've referenced several times, like, objectionable political speech that may be illegal in one jurisdiction or another, like that. The idea that Elon could be subject to a European Union regulation on misinformation from interviewing a former president of the United States, like that also felt like a shot across the bow. And now with Pavel's arrest, if it is platform only related, it does seem like Elon in particular with X is on a collision course.
The term misinformation and disinformation has only ever had one meaning. And that term is information that the government doesn't want published, period. That's what it means. Now, 40, 50 years ago, when the United States didn't really do a whole lot of content policing itself, and neither did Western Europe because they were still relatively free societies, that term was leveled at the Soviet Union and its satellite states and their extensive media control apparatuses and propaganda. So they would say it's misinformation to tell the truth, right? Now we're in a position where basically the same thing is true here. With COVID in particular, there's very little scientific basis for much of the public health response during COVID. There were things like they would allow protests and riots, but they would close down churches. And basically anyone who disagreed was spreading quote unquote public health misinformation. So those terms were very briefly useful in the social media context in 2016 when they were referring to foreign influence operations, right, where the US and everybody else hadn't really gotten on the censorship train as much as they have now. And the Russians were doing some stupid stuff online with bot farms, right?
And they were.
Now,
right? We know
and they were. And that's the classic definition of misinformation. What we're seeing now is that it's just a term to discredit political opponents for expressing opinions that other people don't like, particularly on issues like immigration or right-coded issues. So it has ceased to have its original meaning through misuse. And that's really unfortunate because basically it's saying that here's a perspective I disagree with. And so I'm going to call that misinformation. But like, okay, cool. Where's the lie? Like, is it correct information? Is it incorrect information? Is it debatable? Is it disputable? Is it incomplete? Right? Those are the kinds of designations where you can make an objective determination as to whether the word corresponds with the descriptor is actually corresponding with the reality around the information. But now misinfo, disinfo are so misused that honestly, when someone says it, I'm more likely than not to believe that the statement in question is true.
That's how bad it's gotten.
Yeah.
Before we wrap, Preston, where can the people find you and Byrne and Storm and read more of your content and get in contact with you?
Yeah, so Preston J. Byrne on Twitter is probably where I'm most available. Byrnestorm.com, BYRNESTORM. There's a contact form on there if you want to chat. Similarly, I write on PrestonByrne.com, and that's that my blog is linked to on Byrnestorm.com as well. So if you want to just you got something you want to talk about, you got a legal problem. Along these lines, there aren't a lot of people, I confess, having run a free speech focused and crypto focused law practice for the last sort of 8 or 9 years. There aren't a lot of people who have these kinds of problems, but if you do have that kind of problem, I definitely would love to hear from you and would love to help you fix it.
Definitely recommend Preston and his content. I've been myself educated for a long time by Preston's viewpoints on these issues. Important issues, they never go away. The governments are always pushing back on for example, the public's use of encryption, which is truly, I hope we are destined to fight that battle forever. I'd prefer to win it and not have to fight it any longer, but I think that's far too optimistic. So let's hope that we continue to push back, I think, when it comes to things like encrypted messaging content. I guess we'll have to wait and see what happens with Pavel. Maybe this blows over. Maybe they let him out. Maybe they respond to the UAE.
Maybe this blows over. Oh, you saw the UAE canceled a $10 billion order for a bunch of Dassault Rafale jets. So it's this may be one of those cases where diplomacy solves it and it's taken out of the judicial system's hands. But that's TBD.
Well, thank you to my friend Preston Byrne. And like I said, check out his stuff. And Preston, thank you so much for coming on Galaxy Brains.
Always a pleasure.
That's it for this week's episode of Galaxy Brains. Thanks to Preston Byrne, co-founder partner at Byrne Storm, lawyer, social media, and crypto lawyer. Great conversation with Preston. And of course, our friend Bimnet, a BB from Galaxy Trading, as always. Everyone have a safe and happy weekend, and we will catch you next week. Thanks for listening to Galaxy Brains, the weekly podcast from Galaxy Research. If you enjoy the show, please like, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To follow Galaxy Research, sign up for our weekly newsletter at gdr.email, read our content at galaxy.com/research, and follow us on Twitter at GLXYResearch. See you next week.